A woman in a white dress stands trembling at the altar, not from joy, but from terror. In 3 hours she will become the property of a man she despises, sold like cattle to pay a debt she never owed. Her brother gambled away her freedom. The town watched in silence. But in the shadows of that cold Wyoming morning, a stranger with haunted eyes and calloused hands makes a decision that will change everything. He doesn't know her name. She doesn't know his past. But before the sun rises, he will offer her something no one else ever has: a choice. Stay with me until the very end of this story and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this tale has traveled. Now, let me tell you how it all began. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow as it swept down from the mountains, rattling the wooden shutters of the Crowell cabin like the knocking of an unwelcome guest. Inside, 23-year-old Lydia Crowell sat motionless at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows across her pale face, but she made no move to stoke it. She was waiting. They all were. The clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds with a merciless rhythm, each sound a reminder that time was running out. It was just past midnight, and in less than 6 hours the sun would rise over Bitter Creek, and with it, the end of everything Lydia had ever hoped for. Her mother sat in the rocking chair by the window, a worn Bible clutched to her chest, her lips moving in silent prayer. Martha Crowell had aged 10 years in the past week. Her hair, once the same rich chestnut as her daughter's, had gone gray at the temples, seemingly overnight. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, kept darting to the door, as if expecting the devil himself to walk through. In a way, she was. "He's not coming back," Lydia finally said, her voice flat and hollow. "Thomas isn't coming back." Martha's hands tightened on the Bible. "Don't say that. Your brother will find a way. He promised." "His promises mean nothing, Mother." Lydia set down the cup with a sharp clink. "They never have, and now we're all going to pay for his weakness." The words hung in the air between them, harsh but true. Thomas Crowell, Lydia's older brother by 4 years, had always been the family's greatest hope and deepest disappointment. Charming, handsome, quick with a laugh, and quicker with an excuse, he had inherited their father's good looks and none of his character. When their father died 3 years ago, crushed beneath an overturned wagon on the mountain pass, Thomas had sworn to take care of them. Instead, he had taken everything they had. First, it was small amounts, a few dollars here and there, supposedly for supplies or investment opportunities that never materialized. Then came the drinking, the late nights, the gambling halls that seemed to swallow him whole. Martha made excuses. Lydia watched in silence as their savings dwindled, as the farm fell into disrepair, as the promise of their future crumbled like dry earth through careless fingers. But nothing had prepared her for what Thomas had done 1 week ago. The sound of hoofbeats outside made both women freeze. Martha's prayer stopped mid-word. Lydia's heart lurched against her ribs as she rose slowly from the table, her hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun mounted above the door. "Lydia, don't," Martha began. "Stay here." She crossed to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. In the pale moonlight, she could make out 3 riders approaching on the main road, their dark silhouettes moving with the easy confidence of men who knew they owned the night. At the front rode a figure she recognized instantly, tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that cost more than most families in Bitter Creek earned in a year. Grant Mercer. Lydia's blood turned to ice. "It's him," she whispered. "Mother, go to the back room. Lock the door and don't come out no matter what you hear. I won't leave you alone with go, now." Something in Lydia's voice, the steel beneath the fear, made Martha obey. She gathered her skirts and hurried to the back of the cabin, and Lydia heard the scrape of the bolt sliding home. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, one long, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm the terror clawing at her chest. She checked the shotgun. 2 shells. Not enough to stop 3 men, but enough to make them think twice. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Boots hit the ground. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. "Miss Crowell." The voice was smooth as oil on water, cultured and cold. I know you're in there. I've come to discuss our arrangement. Lydia's jaw tightened. She crossed to the door but didn't open it. There is no arrangement, Mr. Mercer. My brother had no right to make promises on my behalf. A low chuckle from the other side. Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear. Your brother signed a contract, legal and binding. He wagered something of value against his debt, and he lost. I am not property to be wagered. In the eyes of the law, you are whatever the contract says you are. There was a pause, and when Mercer spoke again, his voice had lost its veneer of politeness. Now, I'm going to give you one chance to open this door like a civilized woman. If you don't, my men will break it down. And I promise you, the conversation that follows will be far less pleasant. Lydia's finger found the trigger of the shotgun. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she answered. Then I suppose we'll be having an unpleasant conversation, Mr. Mercer, because I'm not opening this door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, without warning, the door exploded inward. The force of it sent Lydia staggering backward, the shotgun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as she fell. Before she could recover, hands were grabbing her arms, hauling her upright, twisting the weapon from her grip. She kicked and struggled, crying out as rough fingers dug into her flesh. But it was useless. Within seconds, she was pinned against the wall, held fast by two of Mercer's men, while the man himself stepped through the ruined doorway. Grant Mercer was 45 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty that lived behind his eyes. He owned more land than anyone in the territory, thousands of acres of prime grazing ground, mines that pulled copper and silver from the mountains, and the loyalty of men who asked no questions as long as the money kept flowing. He was, by every measure that mattered in Wyoming, the most powerful man for 100 miles, and he had decided he wanted Lydia Crowell. There now, he said, removing his hat and brushing dust from the brim. That wasn't so difficult, was it? Lydia spat at his feet. Mercer's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of anger that promised pain. He tucked his hat under his arm and stepped closer, close enough that Lydia could smell the whiskey on his breath, the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the rot beneath. Your brother owes me $500, he said softly. Do you have any idea how much money that is, Miss Crowell? It's more than your farm is worth, more than this cabin, your livestock, and everything your father ever owned combined. Thomas knew this when he sat down at my table. He knew the stakes, and when he lost, Mercer smiled, and it was the smile of a wolf contemplating a rabbit. He offered the only thing of value he had left. He had no right, Lydia said through clenched teeth. Rights are for people who can afford them. Your brother couldn't afford a cup of coffee, let alone his principles. Mercer reached out and caught her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. You, on the other hand, have something I want. Youth, beauty, spirit. I've been looking for a new wife, Miss Crowell. Someone to grace my table and warm my bed. Someone the territory will respect. And when I saw you at the harvest dance last autumn, his thumb traced along her jaw, and Lydia's stomach turned. I knew you were the one. I would rather die. That can be arranged. Mercer's hand tightened, his fingers digging into her flesh. Your brother is currently locked in my wine cellar with two of my less patient employees. If you don't agree to marry me by sunrise, I'll have them break every bone in his body. Then I'll burn this cabin to the ground with your mother inside, and then— He leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear. I'll take what I want anyway. So you see, my dear, your death isn't really on the table, only your suffering. Tears burned in Lydia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The town won't stand for this, she whispered. Someone will stop you. Mercer laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that was somehow worse than his threats. The town? Miss Crowell, I own the town. I own the sheriff, the judge, half the businesses on Main Street, and the other half owe me favors. Who do you think is going to stop me? The Reverend? He's been accepting donations from me for years. The doctor? His clinic runs on my goodwill. No, my dear. He released her chin and stepped back, adjusting his coat. There's no one coming to save you. There never was. He turned to his men. Keep her here. Watch the mother. I'll return at dawn with the judge, and we'll make this official. To Lydia, he added, "I'd suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." And with that, he walked out into the night, leaving Lydia in the grip of his men and the ruins of her hope. Across town, in the back corner of the Rusty Spur Saloon, a man named Alden Price nursed a glass of whiskey and tried not to think about the past. He was 31 years old, with broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. His hair was dark and a little too long, curling at the collar of his worn leather jacket, and his eyes, gray as storm clouds over the prairie, held the distant look of someone who had seen too much and couldn't forget any of it. Alden had ridden into Bitter Creek 3 days ago, looking for nothing more than supplies and a night or two in a real bed before continuing north to the ranch he'd purchased sight unseen from a widow in Cheyenne. He hadn't planned on staying. He hadn't planned on getting involved in local affairs. He was done with involvement, done with caring about strangers, done with the weight of other people's problems pressing down on his conscience like a millstone around his neck. And yet here he sat, unable to leave, because he'd overheard something in this very saloon 2 nights ago that he couldn't get out of his head. A group of Mercer's men had been drinking at the bar, loud and loose-tongued with liquor. They'd been laughing about the Crowell girl, how Mercer was going to collect her, how her fool brother had practically gift-wrapped her, how she'd fight at first, but they all did, didn't they? And wasn't that half the fun? Alden had gripped his glass so hard it cracked. He didn't know Lydia Crowell, had never laid eyes on her, but he knew her story, or stories like it, with a familiarity that burned like acid in his gut. His own sister Eleanor had been 17 when a man with too much power and too little conscience had decided he wanted her. Alden had been away, fighting in a war that would leave him with scars both visible and invisible, and by the time he came home, Eleanor was gone, buried in the churchyard behind their parents' farmhouse, dead by her own hand rather than submit to a fate she couldn't escape. That had been 6 years ago. Alden had spent every day since trying to outrun the guilt, and failing. Now here he was, in another town, facing another story with the same terrible shape, and every instinct screamed at him to get on his horse and ride. It wasn't his fight. It wasn't his problem. He couldn't save everyone. He couldn't even save the people who mattered, but the face of his sister, pale and still in her pine box coffin, wouldn't let him go. Another? The bartender, a heavy-set man with a waxed mustache, appeared at Alden's elbow. "No." Alden set down his glass and reached for his hat. "I'm done." He pushed back from the table and made his way to the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The street was mostly empty at this hour, just a few horses tied at the rails and the distant sound of piano music from the hotel. Alden stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long moment, breathing deep, trying to quiet the war in his chest. "Walk away," said the voice of reason. "This isn't your fight." But another voice, older, deeper, tied to something fundamental in his soul, answered back. "If not yours, then whose?" He was still standing there, paralyzed by indecision, when he saw the riders coming down Main Street. 3 of them, moving fast, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust in the moonlight. At the front rode Grant Mercer himself, and even at a distance Alden could see the satisfaction on his face, the look of a man who had just won a great victory. Alden stepped back into the shadows and watched them pass. And then, because he was either very brave or very stupid, or perhaps a little of both, he followed. Dawn came slowly to the Wyoming territory, the sky shifting from black to purple to the pale gold of a winter sunrise. In the Crowell cabin, Lydia sat on the floor with her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. Mercer's men had allowed her mother to come out of the back room, but only under supervision. Martha sat now in her rocking chair, weeping silently, occasionally reaching out to touch her daughter's hair with trembling fingers. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? The clock on the mantel read 5:47. In less than 15 minutes, the sun would clear the mountains, and Grant Mercer would return with the judge to make Lydia his wife. There would be no escape. There would be no rescue. There was only the cold, certain knowledge of what her life was about to become. A life of submission and silence, of being owned by a man who saw her as property, of slowly dying inside while her body continued to breathe. I could fight, she thought, When he comes, I could fight. But she remembered the easy cruelty in Mercer's eyes, the casual way he'd threatened her mother, her brother, everything she loved. He would make an example of her. He would break her spirit the way you break a wild horse, with patience and pain and the gradual crushing of hope. Or perhaps she could end it before he had the chance. There was a knife in the kitchen drawer, hidden beneath the dish towels. Sharp enough to... The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Not the thundering approach of multiple riders this time, but a single horse, moving at a steady canter. Lydia lifted her head, frowning. Mercer's men exchanged glances and moved toward the window, hands dropping to their guns. "Stay here," one of them growled at the women. "Don't move." The hoofbeats stopped outside. There was a creak of leather as someone dismounted, then the slow, deliberate sound of boots approaching the cabin. The door, still broken from last night's intrusion, stood partially open, and through the gap, Lydia could see a figure in the gray light of dawn. A tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. A stranger. "That's far enough," called one of Mercer's men, stepping into the doorway with his pistol drawn. "This is private property. State your business or ride on." The stranger stopped. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying the flat vowels of the American West. "I'm looking for Miss Lydia Crowell. I understand she's in some trouble." A bark of laughter from the second guard. "Trouble? Mister, you got no idea. Now get back on your horse before we—" "I also understand," the stranger continued, as if he hadn't been interrupted, "that she owes a debt, $500, to a man named Mercer." Silence from the guards. They exchanged another look, warier now. "What's it to you?" the first one demanded. The stranger reached slowly into his jacket. Both guards tensed, fingers tightening on triggers, but all he produced was a leather pouch, heavy with coin. "I'm here to pay it," he said simply. "In full." Lydia's heart stopped. She was on her feet before she knew she'd moved, pushing past her mother's grasping hands, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. The guards tried to block her path, but she ducked under their arms and emerged through the broken door into the cold morning light. And stopped. The stranger stood 10 feet away, the leather pouch extended in one hand. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with a weathered face and gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. There was a calmness about him, an utter stillness that was almost unnatural, as if he had long ago made his peace with whatever might happen next. "Who are you?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "My name is Alden Price." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect. "I heard about your situation, Miss Crowell. I'm here to offer you a way out." "A way out?" Her voice cracked. "There is no way out. Mercer owns this town. He owns the judge, the sheriff, everyone. Even if you pay the debt, he'll find another way to—" "He can't enforce a contract that doesn't exist." Lydia blinked. "What?" Alden's gaze shifted to the guards who were hovering uncertainly behind her. "The contract your brother signed was for marriage or payment. If the debt is paid before the marriage takes place, the contract is void. That's the law." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I spent yesterday afternoon at the county courthouse reading up on territorial statutes. You'd be surprised what you can learn when you're motivated." One of the guards spat on the ground. "Mercer ain't gonna like this." "I don't particularly care what Mercer likes." Alden's voice didn't change, but something in his eyes made both men take an involuntary step back. "The debt is $500. There's $600 in this pouch. The extra is for your trouble. Take it to your employer. Tell him the matter is settled, and tell him—" Now the steel in his voice was unmistakable. "That if he comes near Miss Crowell or her family again, he'll be settling more than debts." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the first guard snatched the pouch from Alden's hand, weighing it in his palm. He opened it, counted the coins, and nodded to his companion. Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode off toward town, leaving Lydia and Alden standing alone in the gray dawn light. Silence stretched between them, thick, uncertain, charged with something Lydia couldn't name. "I don't understand," she finally said. $600, that's a fortune. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why would you—" "I had a sister." The words were quiet, almost too soft to hear. Had, Lydia repeated. Alden's jaw tightened. For a moment she saw something flicker behind those storm-gray eyes, pain, old and deep and never quite healed. Then it was gone, locked away behind a wall of careful composure. "She's gone," he said. 3 years now. A man like Mercer took an interest in her, and I wasn't there to stop him. By the time I came home, he trailed off, staring at some point past Lydia's shoulder. She was just a girl, 17 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, and that man took it from her because he could, because no one stopped him. Lydia's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." Alden's gaze refocused on her face. "Just understand that I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen again, not if I can help it." "But the money came from a farm I sold 2 years ago, my parents' place back east. I've been carrying it around ever since, looking for a reason to spend it." A wry twist of his mouth. "I'd say preventing a woman from being sold into marriage qualifies." Lydia opened her mouth to argue, to ask 1,000 more questions, but before she could speak, the sound of hoofbeats thundered in the distance. She turned, her blood running cold, and saw a group of riders cresting the hill to the west. At their head, his face twisted with fury, rode Grant Mercer. "Get inside!" Alden's hand was suddenly on her arm, not rough but firm, guiding her back toward the cabin. "Tell your mother to lock herself in the back room. Get the shotgun if you have it, and stay away from the windows." "What are you going to do?" "Buy you some time." He walked past her, out into the open ground before the cabin, and stood waiting as the riders approached. There were 5 of them now. Mercer, the 2 guards who had just left, and 2 more hard-faced men with rifles across their saddles. Lydia didn't retreat. She couldn't. Some force, fear or defiance, or simply the desperate need to see what happened next, kept her rooted to the spot, watching as Alden faced down the most powerful man in the territory with nothing but the revolver at his hip. Mercer reined in his horse a dozen feet away, his face purple with rage. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled. Alden didn't flinch. "Nobody important, just a man passing through." Nobody important doesn't carry $600 in his pocket. Nobody important doesn't stick his nose in other people's business. Mercer's hand dropped to his own pistol. "You've made a serious mistake, friend. That debt was mine. That woman was mine." "The debt is paid," Alden replied calmly. "The contract is void. As for the woman," something dangerous crept into his voice. "She was never yours to begin with." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "You think you can come into my town, throw some money around, and walk away? You think the law will protect you?" "I think the law says what I've done is perfectly legal. I think you know that, or you'd have brought the sheriff instead of hired guns." Alden paused. "And I think you're a bully who's used to having his way, and you don't know what to do when someone stands up to you." A vein throbbed in Mercer's temple. His men shifted uneasily in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Mercer said softly. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Alden took a single step forward, not aggressive, just solid, unmovable. A man who preys on the weak. A man who uses money and fear to take what he wants. A man who has probably never faced real consequences in his entire miserable life. He paused, letting the words sink in. "I've faced men like you before, Mr. Mercer. On battlefields, in prison camps, in the darkest corners of the world you've never even imagined. They all had the same look in their eyes, that certainty that they could do whatever they wanted and no one would stop them." Alden's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "They were wrong." For a long, terrible moment, Lydia was certain that guns would be drawn and blood would be spilled in the dirt before her cabin. She could see the calculation in Mercer's eyes, weighing his odds, measuring the cost of violence against the humiliation of retreat. Then one of his men leaned close and muttered something in his ear. Mercer's face went through a rapid series of expressions, fury, frustration, calculation, before finally settling into a cold, controlled mask. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." He wheeled his horse around and kicked it into a gallop, his men following close behind. Within moments, they had disappeared over the rise, swallowed by the dust and the morning light. Lydia released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "He'll be back," she said. "I know." Alden turned to face her, and for the first time she saw the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. He wasn't as calm as he appeared. He was just very, very good at hiding it. "Which is why we need to talk about what happens next, Ram." They sat at the kitchen table, Lydia, her mother, and Alden, as the sun rose fully over the mountains and spilled golden light through the cabin's small windows. Martha had made coffee, hands shaking slightly as she poured, and now the three of them sat in silence, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on them all. "I don't understand," Martha finally said, her voice thin. "You paid the debt. Why would he come back?" "Because the debt was never the point." Alden wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "A man like Mercer doesn't care about $500. He cares about power, control. He decided he wanted your daughter, and in his mind, that means she belongs to him, contract or no contract. So we're no better off than before." Lydia's voice was hollow. "Not exactly." Alden hesitated, then seemed to come to some kind of decision. "There's another option, one that would take you out of Mercer's reach permanently." "What kind of option?" "Marriage." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Lydia stared at him, uncomprehending. "Marry you?" she heard herself say. "Before you say no," Alden held up a hand. "Hear me out. Wyoming law is clear. A married woman's debts become her husband's responsibility. If you're married to someone else, Mercer has no legal claim to you. He can't force you into a contract that contradicts your existing marriage. And if your husband has the means to challenge him, land, resources, connections, he'd have to think twice before causing trouble. You're proposing a business arrangement. I'm proposing a solution." Alden met her eyes steadily. "I own a ranch about 60 miles north of here, 2,000 acres, plenty of water, good grazing land. I've been planning to settle there permanently. You and your mother could come with me. You'd be safe, protected, free." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Sir, we hardly know you. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly." Alden's voice was patient. "I'm asking you to consider your alternatives. Stay here, and Mercer will find another way to get to you. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next month, but he will find a way. Run, and he'll hunt you down. Men like him always do. But marry me, and you put a legal barrier between yourself and his schemes, one that even he would have to think twice before crossing." Lydia shook her head slowly. "This is madness. We met an hour ago. You don't know anything about me. I know you didn't cry." She blinked. "What?" "Last night, when they broke down your door, when they held you against the wall and Mercer threatened your family. I was there, in the shadows, watching, trying to figure out my next move." Alden's gaze held hers. "You were terrified. I could see it in every line of your body. But you didn't cry. You didn't beg. You looked that man in the eye and told him you'd rather die than submit." He paused. "That tells me everything I need to know about who you are, Miss Crowell. The question is whether you're willing to take a chance on who I might be." The cabin fell silent. Outside, a bird began to sing, a meadowlark welcoming the morning, and the ordinary sound of it seemed strange against the extraordinary conversation happening within. Lydia looked at her mother. Martha's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and hope in equal measure. She wouldn't say it, wouldn't push her daughter toward a decision of this magnitude, but Lydia could read the unspoken plea in her expression. "Please, take the chance. Live." She turned back to Alden. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "what would you expect from me?" "Nothing you're not willing to give." "That's not an answer." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Fair enough. Then let me be specific. I expect you to be a partner, not a servant. I expect you to help me build something worthwhile, a working ranch, a proper home. I expect honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. And I expect that if, at the end of 1 year, you decide this isn't what you want," he took a breath, "I'll grant you a divorce, no questions asked. You'll be free to go wherever you please." 1 year? 1 year, that's all I'm asking for. 12 months to prove that I can be the man you deserve, that this arrangement can become something real. If it doesn't, he shrugged, then at least you'll have had time to figure out your next steps, far away from Grant Mercer and his reach. It was insane, completely, utterly insane. Marrying a stranger to escape another stranger, trading one unknown for another and hoping, praying that she hadn't made a terrible mistake. And yet when Lydia looked into Alden Price's gray eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in any man for a very long time. Respect. Not desire, though perhaps that lurked somewhere beneath the surface. Not possession, not calculation, not the hungry assessment of a man sizing up his property. Just a steady, quiet regard. The look of someone who saw her as a human being first and a woman second. It wasn't love. It wasn't trust. But it was a foundation, and in the desert of her current circumstances, even a foundation felt like a gift. When would this happen, she asked. Today. If you're willing, the sooner we're married, the sooner Mercer loses his leverage. Judge Harrison in Bitter Creek may be in Mercer's pocket, but there's another judge in Willow Springs, 20 miles east. If we leave now, we can be there by midday. Lydia closed her eyes. Her whole body felt like it was vibrating, caught between terror and hope, between the life she had known and the complete unknown that stretched out before her. 1 year. 12 months to learn who this man really was. 12 months to build something or discover that she had made the worst mistake of her life. When she opened her eyes, her voice was steady. Then I suppose we'd better get started. Sam. They left within the hour. Alden had a wagon and a spare horse. Where he had gotten them, Lydia didn't ask. And they loaded what belongings could be quickly gathered. Clothing, her mother's Bible, a few precious family photographs, the kitchen tools that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything else, the cabin, the struggling farm, the graves of her father and grandparents and the small plot behind the barn, would have to be left behind. It hurt more than Lydia had expected. This was her home, the only one she had ever known. Every tree, every fence post, every creak of the floorboards held memories of her childhood, her father's laughter, her mother's songs. And now she was abandoning it all. For what? For the promise of a stranger and the hope that he meant what he said? But when she looked back at the cabin from the seat of the wagon, she didn't see the home she loved. She saw the broken door, the marks where Mercer's men had pinned her to the wall, the shadow of a life that would have been nothing but suffering and submission. She turned away and didn't look back again. The road to Willow Springs wound through rolling hills covered with sagebrush and scattered pine, the landscape opening up around them until they seemed to be the only people in the world. Alden drove the wagon in comfortable silence, handling the horses with the easy competence of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. Martha dozed in the back, exhausted by fear and relief and the emotional whiplash of the past 12 hours. And Lydia sat beside the man who would soon be her husband, trying to make sense of her own tangled thoughts. "Tell me about the ranch," she finally said. The silence had stretched too long. She needed something, anything, to anchor herself. Alden glanced at her. "What do you want to know?" "Everything? If I'm going to live there, I should know what I'm walking into." A pause. Then he nodded. "It's called Stonebrook, named for the creek that runs through the property. Good water, clear and cold, comes right down from the mountains. The land was a cattle operation before, but the previous owner let it fall into disrepair after her husband died. I bought it last spring, sight unseen, from an agent in Cheyenne. Spent the summer making improvements, new fencing, repairs to the barn, patching the roof of the house." "What kind of house?" "Bigger than you'd expect. The original owner was a rich man, made his fortune in the silver mines before turning to ranching. He built the house for his bride, proper construction, stone foundation, 4 bedrooms, a real kitchen with a wood stove, and pump water." A faint smile. "It needs work, but the bones are good. With time and effort, it could be something." Lydia tried to picture it. A real house, not the cramped cabin she'd grown up in. Space to breathe, room to grow. "And you've been living there alone?" "Just me and a half-wild dog I found wandering the property. Called him Ghost." The smile widened slightly. "He doesn't trust anyone. Reminds me of myself." She found herself almost laughing, a rusty, unpracticed sound. "Is that a warning?" "Just an observation." Alden's eyes crinkled at the corners. I should warn you, Miss Crowell. Lydia, if we're going to be married, you should call me by my name. Lydia, then. He tested the word like he was tasting it. I should warn you, Lydia, that I'm not an easy man to know. I've spent a lot of years alone, by choice, mostly. I'm not used to company, not used to conversation. If I seem distant sometimes, it's not because of anything you've done. It's just how I am. I'm not expecting romance. She said it flatly, the words a shield against foolish hope. This is an arrangement, a partnership. You've been very clear about that. I have. He was quiet for a moment. But I want you to know I'm not incapable of feeling. I'm just out of practice. And if there's ever a chance that this arrangement could become something more, he hesitated as if searching for words, I wouldn't be opposed to exploring that possibility. When the time is right. If it ever is. Lydia didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, filed his words away in a corner of her heart, and watched the endless Wyoming prairie roll past them. They reached Willow Springs just before noon. It was a larger town than Bitter Creek, with a proper main street, a 3-story hotel, and a courthouse built of red brick that gleamed in the autumn sunlight. Alden pulled the wagon up in front of the courthouse, helped the women down, and led them inside with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The judge was a small, bespectacled man named Morrison, with a fringe of white hair around his bald head and ink stains on his fingers. He listened to Alden's explanation without visible reaction, examined the documents Alden produced, a property deed, a letter of credit from a bank in Denver, a handwritten affidavit explaining the circumstances, and then turned his sharp gaze on Lydia. Is this what you want, Miss Crowell? She felt the weight of the question pressing down on her. Was it what she wanted? No, she wanted her father back. She wanted her brother to be the man he should have been. She wanted a world where women weren't bartered like livestock and men like Mercer didn't exist. But that wasn't the world she lived in. Yes, she said quietly. This is what I want. Morrison studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. Very well. I'll need 2 witnesses. My clerk can serve as one. Is there someone else? I'll do it. The voice came from behind them. Everyone turned, and Lydia's breath caught in her throat. Thomas Crowell stood in the doorway of the courthouse, hat in his hands, his face a mask of shame and desperation. For a long moment, no one moved. Lydia felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. Thomas, her brother. The man whose weakness and selfishness had brought her to this moment, standing in a strange courthouse, about to marry a stranger because he couldn't resist the lure of easy money and easier excuses. Rage surged through her, hot and pure and overwhelming. How dare you? She whispered. Thomas flinched. Lydia, please. How dare you come here? How dare you show your face after what you've done? I came to apologize. His voice cracked. I came to try to make it right. Make it right? She laughed, a harsh, broken sound. You sold me, Thomas. You signed a piece of paper and sold me to that monster like I was nothing more than a horse or a piece of furniture. And now you want to apologize? I didn't know. You knew exactly what you were doing. Lydia stepped toward him, her hands clenching into fists. You knew what Mercer was. Everyone in Bitter Creek knows what Mercer is, but you were so desperate, so pathetic, so consumed by your own… Lydia. Alden's voice, quiet but firm, cut through her tirade. She stopped, breathing hard, tears burning in her eyes. He's still your brother, Alden said softly. Whatever he's done, he came here. That counts for something. She whirled on him. You're defending him? I'm giving him a chance to speak. Alden's gray eyes were steady. The same chance you gave me this morning. The words hit her like a slap. She wanted to argue, to scream, to demand justice for everything that had been taken from her. But she saw the look in Alden's eyes, not judgment, just patience, and something in her exhausted soul surrendered. She turned back to Thomas. Talk, she said flatly. You have 2 minutes. Thomas swallowed hard. His hands were shaking, she noticed, trembling like leaves in a storm. Up close, he looked terrible. His face was bruised, one eye swollen, nearly shut, and there were raw marks around his wrist that suggested he had recently been bound. Mercer caught me leaving town last night, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After his men came back with the money, he was angry. He thought I'd somehow orchestrated the whole thing. He had me beaten, locked me in his cellar. His voice broke. I thought he was going to kill me. He should have, Lydia said coldly. Thomas flinched again, but didn't argue. You're right. I deserve that. I deserve worse. But Lydia? He took a shaky breath. I escaped. One of his men, a younger one, knew her. He wasn't as cruel as the others. He left the door unlocked when he went to dinner. I ran. And I came straight here because I had to tell you. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't make up for what I did. But I had to say it. I had to look you in the eye and tell you that I know I'm a worthless piece of garbage who doesn't deserve a sister like you. Silence fell over the courthouse. Lydia stared at her brother, this broken, pathetic man who shared her blood, and felt something shift inside her. The rage was still there, still burning, but it was joined now by something else, something that felt almost like grief. This was Thomas, the boy who had taught her to ride, who had carried her home on his back when she twisted her ankle climbing the old oak behind their house, who had held her hand at their father's funeral and promised, with tears streaming down his face, that he would take care of her. He had failed her. Failed spectacularly, catastrophically, in ways that might never be forgiven. But he was still her brother. And he had come. Judge Morrison, she heard herself say, this man is my brother. He can serve as the second witness. Thomas's head snapped up. Lydia, don't, she cut him off. Don't thank me. Don't apologize again. Just stand there and do this one thing right, and then we'll talk about what happens next. He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Yes, of course, whatever you need. Lydia turned back to Alden, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that the situation had just become infinitely more complicated, but Alden simply nodded, offering her his arm. Shall we? He asked quietly. She took his arm, and together they walked toward the judge. Boom. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, nothing like the wedding Lydia had imagined as a little girl, with flowers and music and a dress that wasn't travel-stained and hastily borrowed. Judge Morrison recited the vows in a monotone voice, pausing occasionally to cough or adjust his spectacles. The clerk and Thomas stood as witnesses, both looking deeply uncomfortable for very different reasons. But when Alden slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, produced from somewhere, she didn't ask where. And when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, something shifted in Lydia's heart. This is real, she thought. For better or worse, this is my life now. She looked up at Alden, this stranger who was now legally bound to her, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, perhaps, or hope, or something more complicated than either. It's done, he said quietly. It's done, she agreed, and for the first time in what felt like years, Lydia Price, no longer Crowell, never again to be Mercer, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things might be all right. They left Willow Springs within the hour, Thomas riding alongside the wagon on a horse Alden had purchased from the livery stable. Martha sat in the back, her face a complicated mixture of joy at her daughter's escape and uncertainty about everything else. And Lydia sat beside her new husband, watching the road unroll before them, trying to imagine the life that waited at its end. The journey to Stonebrook Ranch would take 2 days. 2 days to learn who Alden Price really was. 2 days to begin building something from the ashes of the life she had left behind. As the wagon rolled north and the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, Lydia felt a strange sensation settling over her, something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. It was fragile, uncertain, easily shattered, but it was there. And for now, that was enough. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned as they climbed the final ridge, and when they crested the top, Lydia saw Stonebrook Ranch for the first time. The valley spread out below them like something from a dream, green and gold in the late afternoon light, bisected by a silver ribbon of water that wound through meadows dotted with wildflowers. Mountains rose on 3 sides, their peaks already touched with early snow, and at the center of it all sat a house that made Lydia catch her breath. It was larger than Alden had described. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and windows that caught the setting sun like mirrors. A red barn stood nearby, freshly painted from the look of it, and beyond that stretched miles of fencing that marked the boundaries of the property. "Welcome home," Alden said quietly. Lydia couldn't speak. Home. The word felt foreign in her mouth, too large and too fragile to say aloud. For so long, home had meant the cramped cabin in Bitter Creek, the constant worry about money, the shadow of her brother's failures hanging over everything. This vast, beautiful place, seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Martha leaned forward in the wagon bed, her eyes wide. "Lord have mercy, you never said it was this beautiful. I wanted you to see it for yourselves." Alden clicked his tongue at the horses, urging them down the gentle slope toward the valley floor. "The previous owner's wife planted those flower beds along the front. They've gone a bit wild, but they still bloom every spring. And the creek, you can hear it from the porch at night, like music." Thomas rode silently beside them, his bruised face unreadable. He hadn't spoken much since leaving Willow Springs, and Lydia was grateful for the silence. She wasn't ready to have the conversation that needed to happen, the reckoning that awaited them both once the dust of travel had settled. As they approached the house, a shape detached itself from the shadows of the porch and came bounding toward them. Lydia tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the side of the wagon, but Alden just laughed, a low, warm sound she hadn't heard from him before. "That's Ghost," he said. "The dog I mentioned. Don't worry, he's more scared of you than you are of him." The animal stopped a few feet from the wagon, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He was a strange-looking creature, part shepherd, part something wilder, with one blue eye and one brown, and a coat of mottled gray that explained his name. "Ghost," Alden called softly. "It's all right. These are friends." The dog's ears perked forward. He crept closer, nose twitching, and after a moment of careful inspection, his tail began to wag, tentatively at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. "Well, I'll be," Martha murmured. "He does know you. We've spent a lot of long nights together." Alden swung down from the wagon and knelt to scratch behind the dog's ears. "He showed up about a month after I arrived, half-starved, scared of his own shadow. Took me weeks to get him to eat from my hand. Now he follows me everywhere." Lydia watched the interaction, something softening in her chest. A man who could earn the trust of a frightened animal, who would spend weeks patiently coaxing a wild dog to accept kindness. That spoke to something deeper than words ever could. Maybe, she thought, maybe this wasn't such a terrible mistake after all. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior had promised. The main floor held a large kitchen with a cast-iron stove and a hand pump for water, a dining room with a table that could seat 8, and a parlor with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, each with a proper bed and a wardrobe, and a bathing room with a copper tub that made Martha gasp with delight. Everything was clean but spare. The rooms held furniture but little else. No curtains on the windows or rugs on the floors, no pictures on the walls or personal touches that would make the space feel lived in. "I've only been here a few months," Alden said, as if reading Lydia's thoughts. "And I'm not much for decorating. But there's money set aside for whatever you need to make it feel like home. Fabric, furniture, whatever you want. Consider it yours." Lydia ran her hand along the smooth wood of the parlor mantel. "You're being very generous." "I'm being practical. A house isn't a home until someone makes it one. That was never going to be me." He paused in the doorway, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I'm hoping it might be you." She didn't know how to respond to that, the quiet hope in his voice, the vulnerability hidden beneath his careful words. So she simply nodded, and after a moment, he nodded back and went to help Thomas unload the wagon. That first night, they ate a simple meal of bread and dried beef and preserves that Alden had stocked in the larder. Martha insisted on preparing everything, declaring that she would earn her keep or die trying, and the kitchen soon filled with the warm smell of fresh coffee and the comfortable sounds of someone making a house into a home. Thomas sat at one end of the table, still silent, picking at his food without really eating. Alden sat at the other end, answering Martha's endless questions about the property with patient thoroughness, and Lydia sat in the middle, watching them all, trying to understand how her life had changed so completely in the span of a single day. After dinner, Alden excused himself to check on the horses, and Martha announced that she was exhausted and would be retiring early. That left Lydia and Thomas alone in the parlor, the fire crackling between them, the weight of everything unsaid filling the room like smoke. "I know you hate me," Thomas said finally. Lydia stared into the flames. "I don't hate you." "You should." "Maybe." She turned to look at him, really look at him, this brother she had loved and resented and defended and despaired of for as long as she could remember. "But hating you won't change what happened. It won't give me back the life I was supposed to have." Thomas's jaw tightened. "The life with Jacob Morton, you mean? The one father arranged before he died." The name hit her like a physical blow. Jacob. She hadn't let herself think about Jacob in days. The sweet, steady farmer's son she had been promised to since childhood. The man she had expected to marry, to build a life with, before Thomas had destroyed everything. "Jacob's family broke off the engagement when they heard about your debts," she said flatly. "They couldn't risk being associated with scandal. So no, Thomas. That life is gone. Because of you." Her brother bowed his head. In the firelight, the bruises on his face looked darker, more painful. "I'll make it up to you," he whispered. "I don't know how, but I will. I'll work every day for the rest of my life if that's what it takes." "Pretty words. You've always been good at those." "I mean it this time. You've said that before, too." Silence fell between them, heavy and sharp. Thomas stared at his hands, the hands that had signed away his sister's freedom, and Lydia saw something she had never seen in him before. Shame. Real, deep, unflinching shame. It wasn't enough. It might never be enough. But it was something. "Alden says there's work here that needs doing," she said quietly. "Fences to repair, fields to clear, cattle to tend. If you're serious about making amends, you can start there." Thomas looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You'd let me stay?" "That's not my decision to make. This is Alden's ranch." She paused. "But I won't argue against it. As long as you stay away from cards, from liquor, from anything that might bring Mercer's attention down on us. One mistake, Thomas, just one, and you're gone." He nodded rapidly. "I understand. I won't let you down. Not this time." She wanted to believe him. God help her. Despite everything, she wanted to believe that her brother could change, could become the man their father had hoped he would be. But trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. "We'll see," was all she said. The door opened and Alden stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of horses and cold mountain air. His eyes moved between Lydia and Thomas, reading the tension in the room with quiet perception. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Fine," Lydia said. "Thomas was just asking if there might be work for him here." Alden's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He studied Thomas for a long moment. The bruised face, the hunched shoulders, the desperate hope in his expression. "There's always work on a ranch," he said finally. "Hard work, honest work. The kind that builds calluses and breaks your back and doesn't leave much room for the things that got you into trouble in the first place." Thomas straightened. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "We'll see." Alden's voice carried no judgment, just a simple statement of fact. "There's a bunkhouse out past the barn. It's small, but it's clean. You can stay there, at least until we figure out something more permanent." Relief flooded Thomas's face. "Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Price. You won't regret this." "I hope not." Alden moved toward the fire, warming his hands. "For all our sakes." After Thomas had gone to find his quarters, Alden turned to Lydia with a questioning look. "Are you sure about this?" She sighed. "No, I'm not sure about anything right now. But he's my brother. And despite everything—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Despite everything, you still love him." The words were gentle, free of accusation. "Is that foolish?" she asked. Alden shook his head slowly. "It's human. And it's one of the things that makes you different from men like Mercer." He paused. "I had a sister too, remember? If she had lived, if she had made mistakes, I would have given anything for the chance to help her fix them." The raw honesty in his voice made Lydia's throat tighten. She wanted to ask more about his sister, about the pain he carried, about the life that had shaped him into this quiet, complicated man. But the hour was late, and they were both exhausted, and some conversations needed more time and trust than they had yet built. "I should sleep," she said instead. "It's been a long day. The master bedroom is yours. I had Martha put fresh linens on the bed this afternoon." He gestured toward the stairs. "Second door on the right." Lydia frowned. "Where will you sleep?" "There's a settee in my study. I've slept on worse." "Alden." She said his name without thinking, the familiarity of it surprising them both. "This is your house, your bed. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." His gray eyes met hers with quiet firmness. "I told you before, Lydia. I don't expect anything you're not willing to give. That includes sharing a room. When and if that changes," he shrugged, "we'll figure it out. But for now, you need space, privacy, a place that feels like your own." She stared at him, this man who continued to defy every expectation she had of what a husband should be. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, and something passed between them in the firelight, something fragile and new and entirely without name. "Good night, Lydia." "Good night, Alden." She climbed the stairs alone, entered the master bedroom with its large bed and clean sheets, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of the creak through the open window and wondering what kind of life waited for her when the sun rose. The first weeks at Stonebrook passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Lydia threw herself into the work of making the house a home with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She scrubbed floors and washed windows and hung curtains made from fabric she found in the general store in the nearest town, a small settlement called Cedar Falls about 10 miles south. She planted a kitchen garden behind the house, coaxed the overgrown flower beds back to life, and learned the rhythms of the ranch: when to wake, when to eat, when the chores needed doing, and in what order. Martha proved to be an invaluable ally. The older woman took charge of the kitchen with quiet authority, transforming Alden's bachelor pantry of dried goods and canned provisions into something approaching actual meals. Her biscuits became legendary among the small crew of ranch hands Alden had hired, and more than once Lydia caught Ghost lurking near the back door, waiting for scraps. And Thomas worked. It shocked her, truthfully. She had expected him to find excuses, to slack off when no one was watching, to fall back into the patterns that had defined his adult life. But every morning he was up before dawn, helping the hands with whatever needed doing. He mended fences and mucked stalls and hauled water and did 100 other tasks that left him exhausted and filthy by the end of each day. He didn't complain. Not once. Alden noticed. He didn't say anything directly, but Lydia saw the way his attitude toward Thomas gradually shifted, from wariness to cautious acceptance to something approaching respect. After 2 weeks, he started giving Thomas more responsibility. After a month, he was trusting him to supervise tasks on his own. It wasn't forgiveness. That would take much longer, if it ever came at all. But it was progress. As for Lydia and Alden themselves, they danced around each other like two people learning a new language, careful, deliberate, occasionally stumbling over words they didn't know how to say. He was true to his word about sleeping separately. Every night he retreated to his study with its narrow settee, and every morning he emerged looking slightly stiff but never complaining. Lydia offered more than once to find another arrangement, but he always declined. "It's fine," he would say. "I've slept in worse places." She learned, bit by bit, what those places had been. The war came up first, mentioned casually one evening over dinner, something about the cavalry unit he had served with. Then came other fragments. A prison camp in Georgia where he had spent 6 months. A field hospital where he had watched friends die. A homecoming to find his parents' farm abandoned and his sister's grave freshly dug. He didn't tell these stories for sympathy. He told them the way you might describe the weather, as facts, neither good nor bad, simply part of the landscape of his life. But Lydia heard the pain beneath the words, saw the shadows that crossed his face when certain memories surfaced. She shared her own stories in return. Her father's death, her mother's grief, the slow realization that Thomas would never be the man he was supposed to be, the engagement to Jacob Morton that had felt like security rather than love, and the strange relief she had felt when it ended, guilt-tinged but undeniable. "I was supposed to want that life," she admitted one evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. "A farmer's wife. Children. Church on Sundays and quilting bees and growing old in the same house where I was born. That's what good women want, isn't it?" Alden sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm, not quite touching hers. "I don't know what good women want," he said, "but I know what you want." "Do you?" He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft in the fading light. "You want to matter, to be seen as more than someone's daughter or sister or wife. You want a life that you chose, not one that was chosen for you." The accuracy of his words stole her breath. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "Because it's what I want too." They sat in silence as the stars emerged, one by one, scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on dark velvet. And for the first time since her father's death, Lydia felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Understood. Spring arrived slowly, the snow retreating up the mountains day by day, revealing meadows that burst into color almost overnight. The ranch came alive with activity. Calving season, Alden called it, the most demanding time of year when every hand was needed around the clock. Lydia found herself drawn into the work more deeply than she had expected. She learned to help with difficult births, to bottle feed orphaned calves, to recognize the signs of illness or distress in the herd. It was exhausting, messy, often heartbreaking work. They lost more calves that spring than Alden had hoped, but there was also joy in it. The first time she successfully helped deliver a calf on her own, she laughed out loud, covered in blood and fluid and happier than she could remember being in years. Alden found her there, kneeling in the straw, the newborn calf wobbling on unsteady legs beside her. "You're a natural," he said, leaning against the stall door with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'm a mess," she countered, but she was smiling too. "Same thing, on a ranch." He offered her his hand to help her up, and when their fingers touched, something electric passed between them. They both felt it. She saw it in the slight widening of his eyes, the way his breath caught, but neither of them pulled away. "Lydia," he said softly. "Yes?" For a long moment, he just looked at her. The barn was quiet around them, the calf making soft noises as it nuzzled its mother, the dust motes floating in the shafts of light from the high windows. "I'm glad you're here," he said finally. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even really a confession of feeling, but the way he said it, with such quiet sincerity, such genuine warmth, made Lydia's heart stutter in her chest. "I'm glad I'm here too," she whispered back. Summer brought heat and long days and the slow deepening of something neither of them had named. They fell into a routine, the two of them, breakfast together before dawn, a division of labor during the day, evenings on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. They talked about everything and nothing, books they had read, places they dreamed of seeing, memories from childhoods that seemed to belong to different people entirely. And sometimes they didn't talk at all. They simply sat together, comfortable in the silence. Two people who had learned that companionship didn't always require words. The physical distance between them began to close, bit by bit. It started with small things, a hand on her shoulder as he passed, a brush of fingers when she handed him his coffee, the way he started sitting closer to her on the porch, their shoulders almost touching. Then came the moments that lingered, the time he caught her when she stumbled on a loose board, his arms around her waist, their faces suddenly inches apart. The evening she fell asleep by the fire and woke to find herself covered with his jacket, the wool still warm from his body. Lydia found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way he moved, economical, purposeful, with a grace that seemed unconscious. The way he treated the animals, with firm gentleness and endless patience. The way his face transformed when he laughed, which was rare enough that each occurrence felt like a gift. She began to wonder what it would feel like to kiss him. The thought arrived one afternoon while she was hanging laundry, and it shocked her so much that she dropped the sheet she was holding. For months she had thought of their marriage as exactly what it was, an arrangement, a transaction, a practical solution to an impossible problem. The idea that she might actually want him, desire him, had seemed as distant as the moon. But there it was, undeniable. The quickening of her pulse when he entered a room, the warmth that spread through her when he smiled, the dreams that had started coming at night, confused, heated dreams that left her flushed and breathless upon waking. She tried to push the feelings away, to remind herself of the terms of their agreement. 1 year, he had said. 1 year to prove himself, and then she would be free to go. But with each passing day, the thought of leaving felt less like freedom and more like loss. The storm came in late July, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that caught everyone off guard. Lydia had seen storms before. The Wyoming territory was famous for them, but nothing like this. The sky turned black in minutes, the wind howling like a wounded animal, and then the rain came, sheets of it so thick that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The hand scrambled to secure the livestock, and Martha retreated to the root cellar with Ghost, who was terrified of thunder. Thomas was somewhere out on the range. He had ridden out that morning to check on a fence line and hadn't returned. Lydia stood at the window, watching the chaos, her stomach tight with worry. "He'll be fine," Alden said, appearing beside her. "Thomas knows enough to find shelter. He won't try to ride back in this." "You don't know that?" "No. But I know your brother has come too far to do something stupid now." He put a hand on her shoulder. "Have a little faith." She turned to look at him, ready to argue, but the words died in her throat. He was soaked from his own dash across the yard, his hair plastered to his forehead, his shirt clinging to the muscles of his chest and arms. Water dripped from his jaw, ran down his neck, pooled in the hollow of his collarbone. He was, she realized with sudden clarity, beautiful. "Lydia?" His voice was concerned. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer. Instead, acting on instinct rather than thought, she reached up and pushed a strand of wet hair from his forehead. He went very still. "Lydia," he said again, but this time her name was a question, a plea, a prayer. "I don't want to go," she heard herself say. "Go where?" "Anywhere. When the year is up, when I'm supposed to be free to leave. I don't want to go." Her hand moved from his hair to his cheek, feeling the roughness of stubble, the warmth of skin. "I want to stay. Here. With you." Something broke open in his expression, a dam that had been holding back an ocean. "You're sure?" His voice was hoarse. "Because once this starts, I don't know if I can stop. I've been trying so hard not to feel this, to keep my distance, to give you the space you need, but—" "Alden." She said his name firmly, cutting off his words. "Kiss me." He did. The first touch of his lips was gentle, almost tentative, as if he was still afraid she might pull away. But when she leaned into him, when her hands fisted in the wet fabric of his shirt, something shifted. His arms came around her waist, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate and achingly tender all at once. Outside, the storm raged on, thunder crashing, lightning splitting the sky, rain battering the windows. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Lydia and Alden finally stopped fighting what had been building between them for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alden pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words rough and honest and trembling with emotion. "I've loved you since the day you stood on that porch with a shotgun, ready to die rather than submit. I've loved you through every meal we've shared, every conversation, every moment of silence that felt more intimate than words. I love you, Lydia Price, and I don't care if it's too soon or too much or more than you're ready to hear." Tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater that still clung to her skin. "I love you too," she whispered. He kissed her again, and she tasted salt and rain and the beginning of something beautiful. Later, much later, they sat together by the fire, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the flames dance. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world and a silence that felt sacred. Martha had emerged from the root cellar and was busy making tea in the kitchen, pretending not to notice the change that had come over her daughter and son-in-law. Thomas had returned safely, having sheltered in an abandoned line shack, and was currently in the bunkhouse, oblivious to the shift that had taken place in his absence. "So what happens now?" Lydia asked, her head resting on Alden's shoulder. He tightened his arm around her. "Now we build a life. A real one, Not an arrangement or a contract or a practical solution. A marriage. And the 1-year agreement? Void. He pressed a kiss to her hair. As far as I'm concerned, you're stuck with me forever. She smiled, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. I think I can live with that. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Lydia's life. She and Alden moved forward carefully, respectfully, letting their physical relationship develop at its own pace. He was patient, endlessly patient, never pushing, always asking, treating her body and her boundaries with a reverence that made her fall more deeply in love with him every day. They began sharing the master bedroom. The first night, they simply held each other, learning the shape of sleeping side by side. The second night, there were kisses, long, slow, exploratory. By the end of the first week, they had crossed the final threshold, and what Lydia discovered there was nothing like the cold duty she had expected marriage to require. With Alden, there was warmth, tenderness, a give and take that left her breathless and satisfied and hungry for more. I didn't know it could be like this, she admitted one morning, lying tangled in the sheets with sunlight streaming through the window. Alden traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Like what? Good, natural. Something you want instead of something you endure. His hand stilled. Is that what you thought marriage would be? Endurance? That's what my mother told me, and the women at church. They said a wife's duty was to submit, to let her husband take what he needed and be grateful if he was gentle about it. She turned to face him. No one ever told me it could be a partnership, that both people could give and receive. Something fierce flickered in Alden's eyes. Those women were wrong, and any man who treats his wife as something to endure rather than cherish doesn't deserve the title of husband. She reached up and touched his face, marveling at the fact that this man, this kind, strong, complicated man, was hers. I'm glad I found you, she said softly. I'm glad I found you too. They might have stayed in bed all morning, but the ranch didn't run itself, and there was always work to be done. So they rose, dressed, and went out to face the day, together, as partners, as husband and wife in every sense that mattered. August brought the county fair in Cedar Falls, and Alden insisted that they all attend. You've barely left the ranch since you arrived, he pointed out. It's time you met the neighbors. Let them see who the new Mrs. Price is. Lydia was nervous. She had no idea what the local society would think of her. This woman who had appeared out of nowhere and married a man no one knew anything about. But Martha was delighted at the prospect, and even Thomas seemed cautiously excited. They drove into town in the wagon, all 4 of them, dressed in their best clothes. The fair was held in a meadow at the edge of Cedar Falls, and it seemed like the entire county had turned out. Farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and their families, children running between the booths, the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filling the air. People stared, of course. Lydia had expected that. But the stares were curious rather than hostile, and when Alden introduced her as his wife, she was met with smiles and handshakes and invitations to join quilting circles and church groups and all the other small rituals of frontier society. They like you, Alden murmured as they walked between the livestock pens, his hand warm at the small of her back. They don't know me. They know enough. They see a woman who stands tall, speaks clearly, and isn't afraid to get her hands dirty. That's all that matters out here. By the end of the day, Lydia had made more acquaintances than she could count. There was Sarah Bennett, the doctor's wife, who had a sharp wit and a sharper tongue. There was old Mrs. Halverson, who ran the general store and seemed to know everything about everyone. There was the young school teacher, Miss Emily Porter, who was barely 20 and already weary from the demands of educating a classroom of children ranging from 5 to 15. For the first time since leaving Bitter Creek, Lydia felt like she belonged somewhere. The ride home was peaceful, the wagon rolling through the cooling evening air, the mountains silhouetted against a sky streaked with orange and purple. Martha dozed in the back, Thomas beside her, and Lydia sat close to Alden, their shoulders touching. Thank you, she said quietly. For today. For all of it. He took her hand in his. Thank me in 50 years when we're old and gray and sitting on that porch together. Is that what you want? 50 more years of this? He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft with emotion. I want forever, he said simply. However long that turns out to be. She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the stars come out, one by one, over the land that had become her home. She didn't know what the future held. No one ever did. But for the first time in her life, Lydia wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. She had Alden. She had her mother and her brother and a house full of warmth and a valley full of possibility. She had a life she had chosen, with a man she loved, in a place where she finally belonged. And that, she thought, as the wagon rolled toward Stonebrook Ranch, was more than she had ever dared to dream. End of part 2. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. The autumn leaves had just begun to turn when the first sign of trouble arrived at Stonebrook Ranch. Lydia was in the kitchen rolling out dough for apple pie when she heard Ghost's warning bark. Not the excited yapping he made when greeting familiar faces, but the low, threatening growl he reserved for strangers. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, peering out at the road that wound down from the main pass. A lone rider was approaching, moving slowly, his horse picking its way along the rutted path. Even at a distance, something about his posture made Lydia's stomach tighten. There was an arrogance to the way he sat his saddle, a deliberate casualness that seemed calculated to unsettle. She didn't recognize him, but she recognized the type. Alden appeared from the barn, drawn by Ghost's continued barking. He stood in the yard with his arms crossed, watching the rider approach, and Lydia saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip. The rider stopped about 20 feet from the house and tipped his hat with an exaggerated courtesy that set Lydia's teeth on edge. "Afternoon," he called out. "I'm looking for Mrs. Price. Would that be the lady of the house?" Alden's voice was flat. "Who's asking?" "Name's Corbett. I work for Mr. Grant Mercer, out of Bitter Creek." The man's smile widened, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Mr. Mercer asked me to deliver a message." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. Mercer. After 3 months of peace, she had almost allowed herself to believe he had forgotten about her, moved on to some other prey. But deep down, she had always known better. Men like Mercer didn't forget. They simply waited. She forced herself to move, to push open the back door and step out onto the porch. Alden shot her a warning look, but she ignored it. Whatever this was, she would face it on her feet. "I'm Mrs. Price," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What does Mercer want?" Corbett's eyes traveled over her with a slow, appraising look that made her skin crawl. "My employer wanted me to inform you that he hasn't forgotten his property. He's a patient man, Mrs. Price. Very patient, but patience has its limits." "I'm not his property," Lydia said coldly. "The debt was paid. The contract was void. Tell your employer to find someone else to terrorize." "See? That's where things get interesting." Corbett reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. "Mr. Mercer has been doing some research, legal research, and it seems there might be some questions about the validity of your marriage." Alden took a step forward. "What kind of questions?" "Well, now," Corbett's smile turned predatory. "The judge who performed the ceremony, Morrison, wasn't it? He's been having some financial troubles lately. Gambling debts, if you can believe it. Seems like a common ailment in these parts." He chuckled at his own joke. Anyway, Mr. Mercer was kind enough to help the judge with his situation, and in return, the judge was kind enough to take another look at the marriage certificate. Lydia's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there might have been some irregularities. Missing signatures, improper documentation, the kind of thing that could invalidate a marriage entirely if the right people looked hard enough." Corbett tucked the paper back into his jacket. "Mr. Mercer wanted you to know that he's prepared to pursue this matter through the courts, unless, of course, some other arrangement could be reached." "What kind of arrangement?" Alden's voice was dangerously quiet. "Mr. Mercer is a reasonable man. He understands that Mrs. Price has formed certain attachments. He's not asking her to come back to Bitter Creek." Corbett paused, savoring the moment. "He's just asking for fair compensation for his losses. Say, $1,000, and perhaps a certain piece of property." $1,000, Lydia repeated. "That's twice what the original debt was." "Interest, ma'am, and pain and suffering." Mr. Mercer was very upset when his bride-to-be was stolen from him. Another flash of that ugly smile. "As for the property, Mr. Mercer has his eye on a particular parcel of land, the northeast quarter of your ranch, I believe. Rumor has it there might be copper deposits there. Mr. Mercer is very interested in copper these days. Alden's hand closed around the butt of his revolver. Get off my land! Corbett raised his hands in mock surrender. I'm just the messenger, friend. No need for unpleasantness. He backed his horse up a few steps. Mr. Mercer will be in touch. He'll give you a week to consider his offer. After that, he shrugged. Well, let's just say the courts can be very unkind to women of uncertain marital status. He turned his horse and rode away at a leisurely pace, not once looking back. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by Ghost's continued growling and the whisper of wind through the changing leaves. Lydia stood frozen on the porch, her hands clenched at her sides, trying to process what she had just heard. Alden was beside her in 3 strides, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. It's lies, he said fiercely. All of it. Our marriage is legal. Morrison wouldn't dare. You heard him. Mercer has leverage. Lydia's voice was hollow. If Morrison is in debt, Mercer can make him say whatever he wants. He can forge documents, bribe witnesses, do whatever it takes to get what he wants. Then we'll fight him, in court, if we have to. With what? We don't have $1,000, Alden. We barely have enough to get through the winter. She pulled back, looking up at his face. And even if we did, even if we paid him off, you know it wouldn't end there. He'd just find some other excuse, some other demand. Men like Mercer don't stop until they've taken everything. Alden's jaw tightened. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen since the day they met. That cold, calculating look of a man preparing for war. Then we don't fight him in court, he said quietly. We fight him some other way. That night, sleep was impossible. Lydia lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. Beside her, Alden was equally restless, his body tense, his breathing too controlled to be natural. Tell me about your plan, she finally said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned on his side to face her, his features barely visible in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. During the war, I learned that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who attacks you directly. It's the one who thinks he's smarter than you, the one who's so confident in his own power that he never expects you to fight back. Mercer thinks he's untouchable. Exactly. He's been getting away with this for years, intimidating people, buying judges, using his wealth to crush anyone who stands in his way. He's forgotten what it's like to face someone who isn't afraid of him. Lydia propped herself up on her elbow. Are you not afraid of him? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I've been afraid every day since I met you, afraid of losing you, afraid of not being worthy of the trust you've placed in me. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. But fear isn't the same as surrender, and I will never surrender you to that man. So what do we do? First, we gather information, find out exactly what Mercer is planning, who's working with him, what his weaknesses are. Alden's voice hardened. Then we set a trap. Make him overconfident. Let him think he's winning, and when he makes his move... He left the sentence unfinished, but Lydia understood. You're talking about something dangerous. I'm talking about survival. He sat up, reaching for her hand in the darkness. Lydia, I won't pretend this will be easy. Mercer has money, power, connections. But he also has enemies, people he's hurt, people who would love to see him fall. If we can find them, build alliances, gather evidence of his crimes, you think we can bring him down? I think we have to try. His grip tightened on her fingers. The alternative is spending the rest of our lives running, looking over our shoulders, waiting for him to strike. I won't live like that. And I won't let you live like that either. Lydia was silent for a long time, weighing his words. The safe choice would be to pay Mercer off, give him what he wanted, hope that it would satisfy him. But she knew in her bones that it wouldn't. Alden was right. Men like Mercer never stopped taking until there was nothing left. All right, she said finally. Tell me what you need me to do. The next morning, Alden called a meeting in the main house. Thomas arrived looking worried, his face still bearing the faint traces of scars from his beating at Mercer's hands 3 months ago. Martha came in from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands, her expression drawn tight with concern. Even Ghost seemed to sense the tension, pacing restlessly near the fireplace. Alden told them everything, the messenger, Mercer's demands, the threat to their marriage, and their land. When he finished, silence filled the room. Thomas was the first to speak. "This is my fault." "Thomas," Lydia began. "No. Let me say this." Her brother's voice was rough with emotion. "If I hadn't been so stupid, so weak, none of this would be happening. You'd still be in Bitter Creek, probably married to Jacob Morton, living a normal life. Instead, you're here, running from a monster I created." "You didn't create Mercer," Alden said quietly. "He was a monster long before you sat down at his card table. All you did was give him an opportunity. An opportunity to destroy my sister's life. An opportunity that I chose to accept." Lydia crossed to her brother and took his hands. "Thomas, listen to me. Yes, you made terrible choices. Yes, you put me in danger. But look around you." She gestured at the room, at the ranch beyond the windows. "Do you think I would trade this life for the one I was supposed to have? A marriage to a man I didn't love in a town where I would have slowly suffocated?" Thomas stared at her. You're not angry?" "I was. For a long time I was furious, but anger doesn't change the past, and I'm tired of carrying it." She squeezed his hands. "What matters now is what we do next, and what we do next is fight." Martha spoke up from her corner. "How? We're just ranchers." "Mercer has an army." "Mercer has hired guns and bribed officials," Alden corrected. "That's not the same as loyalty. Those men work for him because he pays them, not because they believe in him. If his money runs out or if they find a better offer," he shrugged, "loyalty can be bought, but it can also be sold." "You're talking about turning his own people against him. I'm talking about showing them that Mercer isn't as powerful as he pretends to be, that there are consequences for the things he's done." Alden leaned forward. "During the war, I had friends, men I served with, men I would trust with my life. Some of them settled in Wyoming after the fighting ended. I've kept in touch with a few. If I reach out to them, explain the situation, you'd be asking them to risk their lives for a woman they've never met," Lydia said softly. "I'd be asking them to stand against a tyrant. That's something they've done before." He met her eyes. "These are good men, Lydia. They didn't fight for 4 years just to watch men like Mercer destroy everything they bled for." Thomas straightened his shoulders. "What can I do?" "You know Mercer's operation better than any of us. His habits, his employees, the layout of his properties. I need you to write down everything you remember, every detail, no matter how small." "I can do that. I'll reach out to my contacts, see what kind of support we can gather. And Lydia," Alden turned to her, "I need you to go into Cedar Falls. Talk to Sarah Bennett, the doctor's wife. Her husband treats patients from all over the county. If anyone knows about Mercer's activities, illegal dealings, people he's hurt, it would be the doctor. You want me to gather evidence. I want you to listen. Women talk to each other in ways they don't talk to men. If there are stories out there, victims who never came forward, crimes that were covered up, you might be able to find them." It was risky. All of it was risky. But sitting here waiting for Mercer to make his next move felt even more dangerous. "When do we start?" Lydia asked. Alden's expression was grim but determined. "Now." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Thomas spent hours at the kitchen table, filling page after page with everything he remembered about Mercer's organization, the names of his foremen, the location of his various properties, the schedule of shipments from his mines, the bribes he paid to local officials. It was a damning portrait of corruption and cruelty, stretching back years. Alden rode out to make contact with his war comrades, returning each night with news of their progress. 2 men agreed to come immediately, former cavalrymen named Jack Sullivan and Marcus Chen, both of whom had settled on small farms nearby. Others promised to arrive within the week, and Lydia went to Cedar Falls. Sarah Bennett welcomed her into her parlor with tea and curious concern, clearly sensing that this was more than a social call. Lydia had debated how much to reveal, but in the end she decided that honesty was the only path forward. She told Sarah everything. When she finished, Sarah was silent for a long moment, her face pale. "I knew Grant Mercer was a terrible man," she finally said. "Everyone knows, but I had no idea." She shook her head. "The things he did to you, the things he's still trying to do." "I'm not the only one," Lydia said quietly. "I can't be. A man like that doesn't suddenly become a monster. He's been doing this for years to other women, other families. I need to find them, Sarah. I need their stories. Sarah's eyes widened. You're planning to expose him? I'm planning to stop him, whatever it takes. For a long moment, the doctor's wife said nothing. Then she rose and crossed to her writing desk, pulling out a leather-bound journal. My husband keeps records, she said, her voice low. Medical records. He's very thorough. Notes on every patient, every injury, every illness. He doesn't share them with anyone, of course. Doctor's confidentiality. She paused. But sometimes, late at night, when he's had too much whiskey, he talks about the ones that haunt him. The women who come in with bruises they won't explain. The men who die in suspicious accidents on Mercer's properties. The families who pack up and leave in the middle of the night because they're too afraid to stay. Lydia's heart pounded. Would your husband be willing to testify? Testify? Sarah shook her head. Against Mercer? He'd be ruined. We both would. But if there were others, if enough people came forward at once, if there was enough evidence that even Mercer's bought judges couldn't ignore, Sarah's face was troubled. I don't know. I just don't know. She clutched the journal to her chest. Let me talk to him. Let me see what I can find out. But Lydia, her eyes were filled with fear. Be careful. Mercer has destroyed people for less than what you're planning. I know, Lydia said, but I'd rather be destroyed fighting than destroyed running. 2 weeks after Corbett's visit, Mercer's deadline passed without response. Lydia and Alden had discussed it extensively, ultimately deciding that silence was their best weapon. Any reply, acceptance, rejection, negotiation, would give Mercer information about their state of mind. Better to let him wonder, better to let his imagination fill in the gaps. The effect was almost immediate. 3 days after the deadline, another messenger arrived. Not Corbett this time, but a younger man, clearly nervous, who delivered a single-sentence note. Mr. Mercer is disappointed by your lack of response and will be taking appropriate action. The threat was vague enough to be unsettling, which was surely the point. But Alden simply crumpled the note and tossed it in the fire. Let him come, he said. A week later, strange things began happening. A section of fence on the north pasture was found cut, allowing a dozen cattle to wander into the hills. Then the well pump broke in a way that looked deliberate. Then someone slashed the harness for the wagon, rendering it unusable until repairs could be made. Testing us, Alden said grimly as he surveyed the latest damage. Seeing how we react. Trying to wear us down. Is it working? Lydia asked. No. His jaw was set with determination. But it means he's getting impatient. Impatient men make mistakes. The real confrontation came on a cold October evening when the aspens had turned to gold and the first frost had painted the valley in silver. Lydia was alone in the house. Alden was out with Thomas and the hands, bringing in the last of the cattle before winter set in, when she heard hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast. Ghost erupted into furious barking. Lydia grabbed the shotgun from above the door and positioned herself at the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 riders emerged from the twilight, their figures dark against the purple sky. At their head, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, sat Grant Mercer himself. He looked older than she remembered, his hair now fully gray, but the cruel intelligence in his eyes was unchanged. He surveyed the ranch with the proprietary air of a man inspecting property he already owned. Mrs. Price, he called out. Or should I say Miss Crowell, I'm told there might be some confusion about your proper title. Lydia's finger tightened on the trigger. Get off my land, Mercer. Your land? He laughed, a rich, theatrical sound. My dear, nothing here belongs to you. It never did. He dismounted smoothly and walked toward the house. Where's that husband of yours, the one who thought he could steal what was rightfully mine? He'll be back soon, and when he gets here, we'll have a civilized conversation about the future. Mercer stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her with those cold, calculating eyes. I have to admit, you've made this more entertaining than I expected. Most people cave within a week. The fact that you've held out this long, he smiled. I respect that. Truly I do. I don't want your respect. I want you to leave. And I want what I'm owed. The smile vanished. I've been patient, Miss Crowell, more patient than you deserve, but my patience has run out. He snapped his fingers and his men began to dismount. Tonight, we settle this, one way or another. You're making a mistake. Am I? Mercer took another step toward the porch. I don't think so. I think your husband is miles away, and by the time he gets back, this will all be over. I think your brother is with him, and your mother is hiding in the cellar, and you're standing here alone with a shotgun that holds 2 shells against 6 armed men. His voice dropped to a near whisper. So tell me, Miss Crowell, what exactly are you going to do? Before Lydia could answer, a voice rang out from the darkness. She's not alone. Mercer spun around. Emerging from the shadows beside the barn came Alden, flanked by Thomas, Jack Sullivan, Marcus Chen, and half a dozen other men Lydia didn't recognize. They were armed, rifles and revolvers gleaming in the fading light, and they moved with the coordinated precision of soldiers. Behind Mercer, his men shifted nervously. 6 against 12 were not good odds, especially when the 12 looked like they knew how to use their weapons. Mr. Price? Mercer's voice was controlled, but Lydia could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid reassessment of the situation. I didn't expect you back so soon. Clearly. Alden stopped about 30 feet away, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. You've made a habit of underestimating people, Mercer. It's going to be your downfall. Big words from a man who married another man's property. Lydia was never your property. The contract your brother signed was void the moment the debt was paid. You know this. Your own lawyers know this. That's why you've been trying to bribe judges and forge documents instead of going through proper legal channels. Something flickered in Mercer's expression. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Alden reached into his jacket and produced a sheaf of papers. These are sworn statements from Judge Morrison, detailing exactly how you coerced him into questioning the validity of our marriage. He was remarkably cooperative once we explained that we had witnesses to his original signing of the certificate, witnesses who couldn't be bought. Mercer's face went rigid. Morrison is a drunk and a gambler. No one will believe. There's more. Alden held up another document. Testimony from former employees of your mining operations, describing unsafe conditions, unpaid wages, and suspicious deaths that were ruled accidents. Testimony from women in 3 different towns about similar situations to Lydia's, debts fabricated or inflated, families threatened, forced marriages arranged. He paused. Would you like me to continue? For the first time since Lydia had known him, Grant Mercer looked genuinely afraid. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Try me. Alden's tone was ice. Right now, copies of these documents are on their way to every newspaper in the territory, as well as to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. By this time tomorrow, your name will be on the front page of every paper from here to Denver. The man who couldn't be touched, finally exposed. One of Mercer's men shifted. Boss, maybe we should... Shut up. Mercer's eyes never left Alden's face. You think you've won? You think a few pieces of paper are going to bring me down? I own this territory. I own the judges, the sheriffs, the politicians. You own men who can be bought. That means they can be bought by someone else. Alden gestured at the armed men around him. These are friends of mine. Good men. Men who don't respond well to bullies and tyrants. And they're not the only ones. Right now, similar groups are gathering at your other properties, your ranch, your mines, your offices in Bitter Creek. If anything happens to me or my family tonight, you'll have nowhere to run. The silence that followed was deafening. Lydia watched Mercer's face cycle through emotions, rage, calculation, disbelief, and finally, something that looked almost like respect. You've put a lot of thought into this, he said quietly. I've had time. Alden stepped forward. Here's how this is going to work, Mercer. You're going to get back on your horse and ride out of here. You're going to leave Lydia and her family alone, permanently. You're going to stop the legal harassment, the property damage, the intimidation, and in return, I won't release these documents to the newspapers. You expect me to believe you'll just let this go? No, I expect you to believe that I'm giving you a choice. Walk away now, and you keep your reputation, your businesses, your pathetic little empire. Fight me, and I will burn it all to the ground. Alden's voice hardened. I've already lost one person I loved to men like you. I will not lose another, so choose carefully. The moment stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Then, from the shadows near the barn, another voice rang out. Actually, I don't think walking away is going to be an option. Everyone turned. Stepping into the light came a man wearing a federal marshal's badge, followed by 3 deputies with rifles at the ready. Grant Mercer, the marshal said, producing a pair of iron manacles. You're under arrest for extortion, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt a man like you knows how. Mercer's face went white. This is outrageous. I demand to speak with my lawyer. Your lawyer is currently being arrested in Cheyenne, along with Judge Morrison and about a dozen other men who thought your money would protect them forever. The marshal smiled grimly. Turns out the new territorial governor doesn't appreciate corruption. Who knew? As the deputies moved to secure Mercer and his men, Lydia descended the porch steps on shaking legs. Alden met her halfway, pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. It's over, he murmured against her hair. It's really over. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But some part of her, the part that had learned too early that safety was an illusion, couldn't quite accept it. How? She whispered. The marshal, the governor, how did you manage all of this? Alden pulled back to look at her face. I told you I had friends. One of them serves on the governor's staff. When I sent him the evidence we'd gathered, he brought it straight to the top. The governor's been looking for an excuse to clean house for months. Mercer just gave him the perfect opportunity. Lydia watched as Mercer was led away in chains, his expensive boots stumbling in the dirt, his carefully cultivated dignity stripped away. His men were being disarmed and lined up, some of them already talking, eager to cooperate in exchange for leniency. It was over. The monster who had haunted her nightmares, who had nearly destroyed her life, was finally going to face justice. And yet, he'll have lawyers, she said quietly. Money, connections. What if he gets out? What if he comes back? Alden cupped her face in his hands. Then we'll face him together, just like we faced him tonight. His gray eyes were steady, filled with a certainty that slowly began to seep into her own heart. I told you once that I would never surrender you to that man. I meant it. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges we face them as partners, as husband and wife. Lydia felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they weren't tears of fear or grief. They were tears of relief. I love you, she said. I love you too. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. Now come inside. It's cold, and your mother is probably worried sick, and I think we could all use a very large glass of whiskey. Despite everything, despite the chaos and the fear and the armed men still milling about the yard, Lydia laughed. She took her husband's hand and walked with him toward the warm light spilling from the windows of their home. Their home. And for the first time since that terrible night in Bitter Creek, she allowed herself to believe that the future might actually be bright. The news of Grant Mercer's arrest spread through the Wyoming territory like wildfire across dry prairie grass. Within 3 days, it seemed everyone from Cheyenne to the Montana border knew the story, how the untouchable land baron had finally been brought low, how a quiet rancher and his brave wife had gathered evidence that even Mercer's bought judges couldn't ignore, how the federal marshals had descended on his empire like avenging angels in the cold October night. Lydia heard the whispers when she went into Cedar Falls for supplies. She saw the curious stares, the respectful nods, the way conversations stopped and started again when she passed. Some people looked at her with something approaching awe, as if she had slain a dragon rather than simply survived one. Others seemed frightened, as if her presence reminded them of their own cowardice. All those years they had looked the other way while Mercer destroyed lives. Sarah Bennett was the first to approach her directly, catching her arm outside the general store with tears glistening in her eyes. My husband wants to thank you, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. He's been carrying the weight of what he knew for years, all those patients he couldn't help, all those suspicious deaths he couldn't investigate. Last night was the first time he slept through without nightmares. He shouldn't thank me, Lydia replied gently. His willingness to provide testimony was crucial. Without the medical records, without his accounts of what he'd witnessed, he was terrified. We both were. Sarah's grip tightened. But you showed us that standing up was possible, that Mercer could be beaten. She released a shaky breath. I think you showed the whole territory. Similar encounters followed throughout the day. The blacksmith who shook her hand with calloused fingers and muttered something about his daughter. The schoolteacher who pressed a small bouquet of dried wildflowers into her hands. Old Mrs. Halverson, who emerged from behind the counter of her general store to enfold Lydia in a surprisingly strong embrace. I always knew you were something special, the elderly woman declared. The moment you walked into my store, I said to myself, Martha Halverson, that girl has spine. And I was right. By the time Lydia loaded her purchases into the wagon and began the drive home, she felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. For so long, she had lived in fear of Mercer, fear of the future, fear that the fragile happiness she had built would be snatched away. Now that weight was lifting, and she wasn't quite sure how to exist without it. She found Alden in the barn, brushing down his horse after what had clearly been a long ride. His face was thoughtful, his movements deliberate, and when he heard her footsteps, he looked up with a smile that made her heart skip. How was town? He asked. Strange. She leaned against the stall door, watching him work. Everyone wants to talk about what happened. They're treating me like some kind of hero. You are a hero. I didn't do anything heroic. I was terrified the entire time. That's what heroism is. Alden set down the brush and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's action in spite of fear. You could have run. You could have paid Mercer off. You could have accepted defeat. Instead, you stood your ground and fought back. We fought back, she corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you. His eyes softened. And I couldn't have done it without you. We're partners, remember? In everything. She rose on her toes and kissed him, tasting dust and sweat and the sweetness that was uniquely his. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, she found herself grinning. Come inside, she said. Mother's making dinner and she'll be furious if we let it get cold. The evening meal that night felt different than any that had come before. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of celebration that went beyond the excellent roast chicken Martha had prepared. Thomas was animated, telling stories about the looks on Mercer's men's faces when they realized they were surrounded. Jack Sullivan and Marcus Chen, who had stayed on to help with the ranch's autumn work, added their own observations, their laughter filling the dining room with warmth. Even Ghost seemed to sense the changed atmosphere, abandoning his usual post by the fireplace to circulate among the guests, accepting scraps and scratches with uncharacteristic sociability. After dinner, when the dishes had been cleared and the fire banked for the night, Alden called for everyone's attention. I know we've all been through a lot these past few weeks, he said, standing at the head of the table with a glass of whiskey in his hand. And I know there's still work to be done. Legal proceedings, testimony, making sure Mercer and his people face proper justice. But tonight, I want to take a moment to recognize what we've accomplished. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Thomas, you showed courage I didn't know you had. The information you provided was essential to building our case. Without you, Mercer might still be free. Thomas ducked his head, color rising in his cheeks. I was just trying to make up for what I'd done. And you have. More than you know. Alden turned to Martha. Mrs. Crowell, you've held this household together through everything. Your strength has been an anchor for all of us. Martha's eyes glistened. I just did what any mother would do. Jack, Marcus, you came when I called, no questions asked. That's the kind of loyalty that can't be bought. The two former soldiers nodded, their expressions solemn but pleased. Finally, Alden's gaze settled on Lydia. And you, he said softly. The woman who stood on her porch with a shotgun and refused to surrender. The woman who walked into a marriage of convenience and transformed it into something real. The woman who showed me that love doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding someone worth fighting for. Lydia felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she refused to look away. I came to Wyoming looking for peace, Alden continued. A quiet place to escape the ghosts of my past. Instead, I found a battle worth fighting and a family worth protecting. He raised his glass. To all of you, and to whatever comes next. To whatever comes next, the others echoed, glasses clinking in the firelight. Later, when the guests had retired and the house had fallen quiet, Lydia and Alden sat together on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket against the autumn chill. The stars blazed overhead, impossibly bright, and the creek murmured its endless song in the darkness. "What happens now?" Lydia asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Now we wait. The trial will probably be sometime in the spring. These things take time to organize. Until then, we keep the ranch running, keep our heads down, and try to live as normally as possible." Is normal even possible anymore? Alden was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, but I'd like to try." He shifted to look at her face. "Before all this happened, I had dreams for this place. For us. I wanted to build something that would last, a real home, a real legacy. Not just for us, but for—" He hesitated. "For children?" The word hung in the air between them, fragile and full of possibility. "I didn't want to assume," Alden said carefully. "We've never really talked about it, and given everything you've been through, I wouldn't blame you if I want children." The words came out before Lydia fully realized she was saying them, but the moment they left her lips, she knew they were true. "I want a family. With you." His breath caught. "Lydia, when Mercer came for me that first night, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never have anything good, no love, no joy, no future worth living for." She turned to face him fully, cupping his face in her hands. "You gave me all of that back. You gave me a reason to hope. And now—" She smiled through her tears. "Now I want to build something beautiful with you, something that proves men like Mercer don't get to win. That love is stronger than cruelty, and hope is stronger than fear." Alden kissed her, long and deep and tender, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were crying. "Whatever children we have," he murmured against her lips, "they're going to be so loved, so protected. They're going to grow up knowing that their parents fought for them before they were even born." "Our children," Lydia repeated, tasting the words. "Our family." They sat together in the starlight until the cold drove them inside. But even then, the warmth in Lydia's chest didn't fade. For the first time in her life, the future felt not just possible, but bright. The weeks that followed Mercer's arrest settled into a pattern of cautious normalcy. The ranch required constant attention as autumn deepened into winter, bringing the last of the cattle to sheltered pastures, reinforcing the barn against coming snows, stockpiling firewood and provisions for the long, cold months ahead. Lydia threw herself into the work with grateful energy, finding comfort in the physical demands that left her exhausted but satisfied at the end of each day. Thomas proved himself invaluable. Whatever demons had driven him to gambling and irresponsibility seemed to have been exorcised by the events of the past months. He worked harder than anyone, arriving first to every task and leaving last, as if determined to earn through sweat and effort the forgiveness he still couldn't quite accept. One evening, Lydia found him in the barn after dark, methodically checking the horse's hooves by lantern light. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his hands were steady, competent. "You're working yourself into the ground," she said gently. Thomas didn't look up. "There's a lot to do before winter. There's always a lot to do. That doesn't mean you have to do it all yourself." "I'm not—" He stopped, took a breath. "I'm just trying to be useful. To earn my keep." Lydia crossed to stand beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "Thomas, look at me." Reluctantly, he met her eyes. "You've already earned your place here, 100 times over. What you did during the confrontation with Mercer, the information you provided, the risks you took, that was payment enough for any debt." "It wasn't enough." His voice cracked. "It will never be enough. I sold you, Lydia. My own sister. I put you in the hands of a monster because I was too weak to face my own consequences. And if you hadn't, I never would have met Alden." She let that sink in. "I know it sounds strange, but I mean it. If you hadn't made that terrible choice, I would still be in Bitter Creek, married to Jacob Morton, living a life that was safe but empty. I would never have known what real love felt like, what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued." Thomas stared at her. You can't mean that. I do. She squeezed his arm. I'm not saying I'm grateful for what you did. The fear, the humiliation, the months of uncertainty, those were real, and they hurt. But I've learned that life doesn't follow the paths we expect. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. And sometimes, she paused, searching for the right words. Sometimes the people who hurt us most become the people we need most. How can you forgive me? The question was barely a whisper. Because holding on to anger is exhausting. Because you're my brother, and I love you despite everything. And because, she smiled slightly, because Alden taught me that second chances are worth giving. He gave me one. I'm giving you one. The question is what you're going to do with it. For a long moment, Thomas was silent. Then, slowly, he set down the hoof pick he'd been holding and turned to face her fully. I'm going to be better, he said. And for the first time, Lydia heard conviction rather than desperation in his voice. Not because I think it will erase what I did, but because it's the right thing to do. Because the man I was, the one who gambled away his sister's freedom, I don't want to be him anymore. Then don't be. He nodded slowly. I won't. I promise you, Lydia. On our father's grave. I will never let you down again. She believed him. Not because the words were new, Thomas had made promises before many times, but because something in his eyes had changed. The desperate, hunted look was gone, replaced by something steadier, more certain. It would take time to fully trust him again. Some wounds healed slowly, and some scars never fully faded. But for the first time, Lydia believed that healing was possible. Come inside, she said. Mother saved you a plate, and the coffee's still hot. I should finish. The horses can wait. Family comes first. A ghost of his old smile crossed Thomas's face. When did you become the wise one? I learned from my mistakes, just like you're learning from yours. They walked back to the house together, and when they stepped through the door into the warmth and light, Lydia felt something click into place. A piece of her heart that had been broken for years finally beginning to mend. Winter arrived with a vengeance in late November, blanketing the valley in snow that piled up to the windowsills and transformed the familiar landscape into something from a fairy tale. The ranch work shifted from outdoor labor to indoor maintenance, repairing equipment, tending to animals in the barn, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a household running through the long, cold months. Martha seemed to thrive on the enforced domesticity, filling the house with the smell of baking bread and the sound of her hymns as she worked. Lydia found herself spending long hours by the fire, reading books from the small library Alden had accumulated, or working on the quilt she had started in October, a project that gave her hands something to do while her mind wandered. She thought often about the baby she hoped to carry. Each month that passed without conception brought a small disappointment, quickly pushed aside. These things took time, she reminded herself. There was no rush. But sometimes, late at night, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to hold her own child, to see Alden's gray eyes or her own chestnut hair in a tiny, perfect face, to watch a new life grow in the home they had built together. The image made her heart ache with longing. You're quiet tonight, Alden observed one evening, finding her staring into the flames with the quilt forgotten in her lap. Just thinking. About? She hesitated, then decided on honesty. About whether I'll ever be a mother. Alden settled into the chair beside her, his expression thoughtful. It's only been a few months. I know. I'm not worried. Not really. She sighed. I just want it so much, more than I realized. So do I. He reached over and took her hand. But these things happen in their own time, and if they don't happen the natural way, there are other options. Children who need homes, families who need building. Lydia looked at him with surprise. You'd consider that? Adopting? I'd consider anything that makes you happy. His thumb traced circles on her palm. The only thing I won't consider is giving up. We're going to have a family, Lydia, one way or another. I promise you that. She leaned over and kissed him, tasting the firelight and the promise of a future still unwritten. December brought news from Cheyenne. A letter arrived on the 15th, carried by a rider who had braved the snow-covered roads to deliver it personally. Alden read it at the kitchen table, his face expressionless, while Lydia watched with growing anxiety. "Well?" she finally asked when she couldn't stand the suspense any longer. "Mercer's trial date has been set, February 12th. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "They want us both to testify." Lydia's stomach clenched. She had known this was coming, had been preparing for it, in a way, but the reality still hit her like a blow. "Both of us?" "You're a key witness, the primary victim of his scheme. Without your testimony, the case is much weaker." Alden reached across the table to take her hand. "You don't have to do this. I can speak to the prosecutor, explain that you're not able to—" "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. "I'll do it. I need to do it." "Are you sure?" "I spent months living in fear of that man. He took my freedom, my dignity, my sense of safety. If testifying against him is what it takes to make sure he never does that to anyone else—" She squared her shoulders. "Then I'll stand up in that courtroom and tell them everything." Pride warmed Alden's expression. "That's my brave girl." "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I know. So am I." He stood and circled the table to pull her into his arms. "But we'll face it together, like we face everything." The days leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of preparation. Martha insisted on decorating the house with whatever greenery could be found, sending Thomas and the remaining hands on expeditions to gather pine boughs and holly berries. A small tree was set up in the parlor, decorated with candles and ribbons and the few precious ornaments Martha had brought from Bitter Creek. Lydia threw herself into the festivities with desperate energy, using the distraction to keep her mind off the looming trial. She baked pies and cookies, wrapped small gifts for each member of the household, and spent hours working on a special project she had kept secret from Alden. It was a shirt, sewn by hand from the finest wool she could find in Cedar Falls. Simple in design but beautifully made, with careful stitching and mother-of-pearl buttons she had ordered specially from the general store. It was the first garment she had ever made entirely on her own, and she was unreasonably proud of it. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the stars blazing overhead like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The household gathered in the parlor after dinner, warmed by the fire and the glow of candles on the tree. Alden produced a bottle of fine brandy he had been saving, and glasses were poured for everyone, even Thomas, who hesitated before accepting. "One drink?" Lydia told him. "It's Christmas." He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "One drink." Martha led them in carols, her voice thin but true, and soon the whole room was singing, even Alden, whose baritone turned out to be surprisingly pleasant. Ghost howled along from his spot by the fire, adding his own discordant harmony to the proceedings. When the singing faded, Alden cleared his throat. "I have something," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A gift. For Lydia." "Presents are for tomorrow morning," Martha protested, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. "This one can't wait." He crossed to where Lydia sat and knelt before her, and her heart began to pound. "When we married," he said softly, "it was an arrangement, a transaction. I gave you my name and my protection, but I couldn't give you my heart. I didn't think I had one left to give." "Alden, let me finish." He took her hands in his. "These past months, you've shown me that I was wrong. You've taught me that love isn't weakness, it's strength. That opening your heart to another person isn't a risk, it's a gift." He produced a small velvet box and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a ring, a delicate band of gold set with a single sapphire that caught the candlelight and seemed to glow from within. "This was my mother's," Alden said, his voice rough with emotion. "She gave it to me before she died and asked me to give it to the woman I loved. I've carried it with me for 10 years, never believing I'd find someone worthy of wearing it." Tears were streaming down Lydia's cheeks. "It's beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you." He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. "Lydia Price, I'm not asking you to marry me. You already have. I'm asking you to stay married to me. Forever. Not because of contracts or circumstances or practical arrangements, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible. Because I can't imagine my life without you. Because you are my home, my heart, my everything." For a moment, Lydia couldn't speak. The weight of his words, the beauty of the ring, the love shining in his gray eyes, it was almost too much to bear. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, pouring every ounce of love and gratitude and joy into the gesture. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Forever, always. Yes." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Martha was crying openly, and even Thomas was blinking suspiciously bright eyes. Ghost barked and wagged his tail, caught up in the excitement he didn't quite understand. Later, when the celebrations had wound down and the household had retired, Lydia and Alden sat alone by the dying fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching for the wrapped package she had hidden behind her chair. Alden raised an eyebrow. "You didn't have to open it." He unwrapped the paper carefully, revealing the shirt she had made. For a long moment, he just stared at it, running his fingers over the careful stitching, the smooth fabric, the pearl buttons. "You made this?" he asked softly. "Every stitch. I wanted to give you something that came from me, not just from a store." She bit her lip. "Do you like it?" Instead of answering, he pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that took her breath away. "I love it," he murmured. "I love you. I love everything about this life we're building together." "Even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts." He pulled back to look at her face. "The hard parts are what make the good parts worth fighting for." Outside, snow began to fall, soft, silent, transforming the world into something clean and new. Inside, wrapped in warmth and love and the promise of a future worth waiting for, Lydia closed her eyes and let herself believe that everything was going to be all right. The winter solstice had passed, and each day brought a few more minutes of light. Spring would come, and with it the trial and whatever challenges awaited beyond. But for now, on this holy night, there was only peace. Peace and love, and the quiet certainty that she had finally found where she belonged. The courtroom in Cheyenne was smaller than Lydia had imagined, with wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use and windows that let in the pale February light. She sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as Grant Mercer was led to the defendant's table in chains. He looked diminished somehow, smaller, older, stripped of the expensive clothes and arrogant bearing that had made him seem so invincible. His eyes, when they found hers across the crowded room, held none of the predatory confidence she remembered. Instead, she saw something that might have been fear. Good, she thought. Let him know what it feels like. Alden sat beside her, solid and reassuring, his hand covering hers beneath the folds of her skirt. On her other side, Thomas waited with rigid posture, his jaw set with determination. Martha had stayed behind at the ranch. The journey was too difficult for her aging bones, but her prayers traveled with them. The trial lasted 3 days. Witness after witness took the stand, painting a picture of corruption and cruelty that stretched back decades. Former employees described dangerous working conditions and mysterious deaths. Women from 3 different towns told stories eerily similar to Lydia's. Debts fabricated, families threatened, lives destroyed for the amusement of a man who believed himself above the law. Judge Morrison testified, his hands shaking, his voice barely above a whisper as he described the bribes and threats that had compromised his judgment for years. The federal prosecutor produced document after document, forged contracts, falsified records, ledgers showing payments to officials across the territory. And then it was Lydia's turn. She rose on unsteady legs and walked to the witness stand, acutely aware of every eye in the room following her progress. The chair was hard beneath her, and she gripped the armrest to keep her hands from trembling. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Lydia Price." Formerly Lydia Crowell. "Mrs. Price, please tell the court how you came to know the defendant." She took a breath and began to speak. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain, but as she continued, something shifted. The fear that had gripped her since entering the courthouse began to loosen its hold, replaced by a cold, clear anger that steadied her voice and sharpened her memory. She told them everything. The night Thomas had come home with terror in his eyes and a death sentence hanging over his head. The forced contract, the threats, the moment Mercer's men had broken down her door and pinned her against the wall. The way Mercer had looked at her, like property, like prey, like something to be consumed and discarded. She told them about Alden's intervention, their hasty marriage, the months of harassment that followed, the cut fences and broken pumps, the intimidation, the night Mercer had ridden to Stonebrook with his men, intending to take by force what he couldn't take by law. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, but his questions were half-hearted, his challenges easily deflected. Whatever confidence he had possessed at the trial's opening had evaporated in the face of overwhelming evidence. As Lydia stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met Mercer's one final time. He stared at her with naked hatred, his lips twisted in a silent snarl, but she didn't look away. She held his gaze until he was the one who broke, dropping his eyes to the table before him. She had won. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations. Lydia sagged against Alden, tears of relief streaming down her face as the judge pronounced sentence: 25 years in the territorial prison with no possibility of parole. Mercer was led away in chains, his face a mask of disbelief. As he passed Lydia's row, he stopped, forcing the guards to halt. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won, but I have friends, powerful friends. One day, Mr. Mercer," Alden's voice cut through the threat like a blade. "You have nothing. Your money is gone. Your allies have abandoned you. Your empire is in ruins." He stood, placing himself between Mercer and Lydia. "You're going to die in prison, alone and forgotten, and no one will mourn you. That is your legacy. That is what your cruelty has earned." For a moment, something flickered in Mercer's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or despair. Then the guards pulled him forward, and he was gone, swallowed by the crowd and the machinery of justice. Lydia turned to Alden, burying her face in his chest. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over." "It's over," he confirmed, holding her close. "He can never hurt you again." Spring arrived early that year, as if the land itself was celebrating their victory. The snow melted from the valley floor in late February, revealing meadows already tinged with green. The creek swelled with runoff from the mountains, its song louder and more joyful than Lydia had ever heard it. Birds returned in flocks, filling the air with their calls, and the first wildflowers began to push through the softening earth. Lydia stood on the porch one morning in early March, wrapped in a shawl against the lingering chill, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. She had been feeling strange for the past few weeks, tired more easily, nauseated in the mornings, sensitive to smells that had never bothered her before. She knew what it meant. She had known for days, but she hadn't said anything, hadn't wanted to speak the words aloud until she was certain. Now she was certain. The door opened behind her and Alden stepped out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one, then stopped, studying her face with sudden concern. "You're pale. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling wonderful." She took a sip of coffee, then set it aside. The smell was too strong this morning. "Actually, there's something I need to tell you." His concern deepened. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, watching his face as understanding dawned. "Lydia, are you?" "I'm pregnant." The words came out as a whisper, half afraid that saying them too loudly would somehow make them untrue. "I've been counting the days, and I'm certain. We're going to have a baby, Alden." For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression frozen. Then his face broke into a smile so radiant it seemed to light the entire valley. "A baby," he repeated. "Our baby. Our baby." He swept her into his arms, spinning her around on the porch until she laughed and begged him to stop. When he set her down, there were tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you so much it hurts." "I love you too." She reached up to wipe his tears away. "And I love this little one already, even though it's no bigger than a bean." "No bigger than a bean," he repeated wonderingly, "but already so loved." The news spread quickly through the household. Martha wept with joy, immediately launching into plans for blankets and booties and all the tiny garments a baby would need. Thomas went pale, then grinned, then pulled Lydia into a fierce hug that lifted her off her feet. "I'm going to be an uncle," he said, his voice thick. "I'm going to be the best uncle this territory has ever seen." "You'd better be," Lydia replied. "This child is going to need good influences in their life." "Then they're lucky to have you and Alden." Thomas's expression grew serious. "I mean it, Lydia. What you've built here, this family, this home, it's something worth protecting, and I swear I will spend the rest of my life helping you protect it." She believed him. He believed. After everything they had been through, after all the pain and betrayal and slow, painful rebuilding of trust, she finally, truly believed him. The wedding was Alden's idea. "We've already been married for almost a year," Lydia pointed out when he first suggested it. "What's the point of another ceremony?" "The point is choice." He took her hands in his gray eyes serious. "Our first wedding was a transaction, a practical solution to an impossible situation. I don't regret it, not for a moment, but I want something more. I want to stand up before God and our community and choose you, freely, openly, without fear or coercion." She understood then. The first wedding had been about survival. This one would be about love. They set the date for the first week of May, when the wildflowers would be in full bloom and the weather would be warm enough for an outdoor celebration. Invitations went out to everyone who had supported them: Sarah Bennett and her husband, the friends who had stood with them against Mercer, neighbors from Cedar Falls and beyond. Lydia chose a new dress for the occasion, soft cream fabric with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Martha spent hours adjusting the fit to accommodate her growing belly, tears in her eyes as she worked. "Your father would be so proud," she said quietly. "He always wanted you to marry for love." "I did," Lydia replied. "It just took me a while to realize it." The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, without a cloud in the vast Wyoming sky. They gathered in the meadow behind the house, where the creek sang its eternal song and the mountains stood witness like ancient guardians. Wildflowers carpeted the ground, purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf, white phlox and orange paintbrush, creating a natural cathedral more beautiful than any church. Reverend Peters, who had traveled from Cedar Falls to perform the ceremony, stood waiting near the water's edge. Alden stood beside him, dressed in his finest suit, the shirt Lydia had made for him visible beneath his jacket. His face, when he saw her approaching on Thomas's arm, held an expression of such pure love that Lydia felt her heart might burst. She walked toward him through the flowers, her feet barely touching the ground, aware of nothing but the man waiting for her at the end of the path. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, and the Reverend began to speak. The words were traditional: love, honor, cherish, but they felt different this time. Not obligations to be endured, but promises freely made, not chains, but wings. "I, Alden James Price, take you, Lydia Rose, to be my wedded wife," Alden said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. I, Lydia Rose Price, take you, Alden James, to be my wedded husband," Lydia replied, her voice breaking on the last word. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." The Reverend smiled. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Alden pulled her close and kissed her, and the gathered guests erupted in cheers and applause. The sound echoed off the mountains, carrying their joy to the heavens. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food that Martha and Sarah Bennett had spent days preparing. Music came from a fiddle and guitar played by ranch hands, and soon couples were dancing on the grass, their laughter mixing with the melody. Lydia danced with Alden, then with Thomas, then with Jack Sullivan and Marcus Chen and half a dozen other men who had become friends over the past months. Her feet ached and her pregnant body protested, but she couldn't stop smiling. As the evening deepened and the stars emerged, she found herself standing apart from the celebration, looking out over the valley that had become her home. The creek glimmered in the moonlight, the mountains rose dark against the sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, not threatening, but welcoming, as if nature itself was acknowledging her place in this wild, beautiful land. Alden appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "I'm thinking about how strange life is." She leaned into him. "A year ago, I was about to be sold to a monster. I thought my life was over. And now, she gestured at the celebration behind them, at the house, the ranch, the future growing inside her. Now I have everything I ever wanted, more than I ever dared to dream. I know what you mean. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I thought I was buying your freedom that day in Bitter Creek, paying a debt to release you from an obligation. And instead, he turned her to face him, cupping her face in his hands. Instead, you became mine, and I became yours. Not through transaction or coercion, but through something I never expected to feel again. His voice dropped to a whisper. I thought I was buying your freedom, Lydia, but you became mine. She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble, the warmth of his skin. You didn't save my life, she said softly. You gave me a new one. He kissed her again, gentle and deep, and she tasted the promise of forever on his lips. Behind them, the celebration continued, laughter and music and the sounds of a community coming together to honor love. Above them, the stars blazed in the infinite Wyoming sky, and before them stretched a future bright with possibility, a ranch to build, a child to raise, a lifetime of moments yet to be shared. Lydia Price had once been a woman with no choices, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Now she was a woman who had chosen her own path, forged her own destiny, and found in the arms of a quiet cowboy the love that made every struggle worthwhile. The story of how she came to Wyoming would be told for generations, passed down around campfires and kitchen tables, a tale of courage and resilience and the transformative power of love. But for Lydia herself, standing in the moonlight with her husband's arms around her and her baby quickening in her womb, the story was simple. She had been lost, and now she was found. She had been afraid, and now she was brave. She had been alone, and now she was home. And that, she thought as she turned back toward the warmth and light of the celebration, was the only ending that mattered. Not an ending at all, really, just the beginning of everything.